Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Untethering Shame podcast. I'm your host, Kira Wackett, and today we're here for another solo deep dive episode to talk about a topic super important and yet often overlooked or even normalized in our fast-paced lives: burnout. Whether you're a student, professor, parent, anyone juggling multiple responsibilities, burnout can creep in and affect us in ways we might not even realize. Today, we're going to shed some light on what burnout really is, how to recognize its signs, and most importantly, how to prevent it from taking over your life. So grab a seat, get comfortable, and let's have an honest conversation about burnout and the strategies we can use to reclaim our well-being. I want to start by getting us all on the same page. So let's define what burnout actually is. Again, we've heard it. The term is used all the time, almost like a badge of honor. Oh, I'm so busy. I'm so burnt out. But what are we saying when we're actually saying that? Burnout is a psychological response to prolonged, meaning kind of long-term experience, not just sort of short bursts, prolonged and or graded, which might mean more compounding or kind of spurts of more of that graded exposure to stressors. It's often referred to as a syndrome or illness and can have extreme mental, emotional, and physical impacts on the individual. People often describe burnout as this sense of kind of a breaking point. Like they feel like they're going, and then they reach this end point, which just feels so overwhelming and almost like they're staring down a cliff and it feels like the only place to go is down. Now, I really like to conceptualize burnout from sort of the notion of a spectrum of experiences. So if 0 is the whole world is glitter, unicorns, butterflies, and 100 is I am full-blown burnout, we really all are existing somewhere in that 1 to 99. So there's kind of this compounding sense of fatigue, resentment, shame, low self-efficacy that builds. And once we reach that point, we're burnt out. But a lot of us have been using that word to describe the experience of the 1 to 99 as well. So what's really important is for us to really kind of break down that this is something that we experience on a spectrum, and there's still a peak point that we need to be talking about and very mindful of. And for a lot of us, realizing that the reason we're using that term just so normalized is we've been conditioned to believe that we have to be 40, 50, 60, 90% of the way to burnout to be producing anything of value or to have worth as an individual. Now, burnout consists of 3 key characteristics. If we go back again to that spectrum idea, you'll notice that each of these things can happen in waves. So there's emotional exhaustion, detachment or depersonalization, and then third, low self-efficacy or a general sense of apathy. Now, if I'm at 40% of the way to burnout, I can experience emotional exhaustion, detachment, and a sense of apathy. If I'm at 70 or 90%, I can experience it. So again, the waves and the intensity might be different depending on where we fall, but we'll experience it at any point on that spectrum. Now, let's break those down just a little bit. Emotional exhaustion is essentially when we find ourselves so mentally and emotionally tired, it becomes hard to engage in daily life. I often equate this with compassion fatigue, or essentially that I've cared too much for too long for too many people, kind of the overing of the twos, TOO, that just leads us to that sense of depletion. Detachment or depersonalization essentially means that we detach from our life. We stop empathizing, caring, we almost become apathetic. We're existing, we're going through the motions, but there's no emotional sense of self that's existing in that. And then third is low self-efficacy and apathy. So over time, what we see, particularly with that exhaustion and that detachment, is this kind of what's the point? I've got no value. I've got no worth. No matter what I do, everything is still going to be hard. So the effort seems futile. What we've learned then is that burnout kind of manifests in a different set of symptoms. And what's interesting as I go through these is you're going to see, particularly I think after COVID, when all of us were like, oh my gosh, it could be a scratch, a sore throat, a cold. It could be a fever. It could be an itch on my bottom foot. We don't know. It could be COVID. That's kind of the way the burnout seems to be too. You'll notice as I say this, a lot of you could say, gosh, that could be just being really tired. That could be somebody about to get their period or going through menopause or having other hormonal imbalances, or maybe somebody with anxiety or depression. But the point is just to notice that we experience symptoms that are unlike our normal, or again, maybe we've conditioned to be normal, but are maladaptive, unhealthy, or hurtful for our daily life. So mentally, what we'll see when someone's again on that spectrum or reaching that point of severe burnout, they're going to develop more of a tunnel vision. What that means is basically you only see the world as it's happening to you and how it connects to you. You kind of write yourself in or insert yourself into every story. And in that, you really only see the negatives, how you're hurting someone, how someone's hurting you, how stuff's going wrong. On top of that, you start to become more forgetful, have a harder time concentrating, which, as you can imagine, then leads to loss of productivity, marked or diminished performance overall. And then we can also see some more rigid thinking. What we know is that as people sort of increase in that intensity, again, with burnout or with other mental health things, their thinking becomes less flexible. We're really just, everything has to be this way. This is how it exists. I'm anxious if the plan changes. And in that, we also notice just a lot more negativity, predominantly negative self-talk, but also just negativity about everything. On a social and emotional standpoint, you can experience a pretty much pervasive state of dread, maybe avoiding and isolating from other people. A lot of people that experience burnout talk about just a high level of anxiety and panic, almost like their body's in a ready state for something to go wrong. You can also experience a general state of malaise. So sadness, loss of hope, increased sense of worthlessness, guilt, shame. Again, you can start to see how some of this stuff could be being overtired, having a cold, being depressed, whatever that might be. And then lastly, we can see a lot of anger and irritability that comes out. There's a lot of kind of reactivity. And I think some of that is that rigid thinking. There's also a little bit of, I think, paranoia that can happen because you, again, see the world through this very narrow tunnel. And so anything that happens, you're sort of ready on the defense, and that can lead one to be very reactive. And then physically, we know that when people are, again, kind of on that spectrum, we can see things like digestive upset, diarrhea, constipation, acid reflux, dizziness, fainting, headaches, shortness of breath, chest pain, insomnia, decreased immune responses. I often think about this too, even with our food intakes. We can have, maybe we're more hungry, we're less hungry. Now, again, as you think about all of these different symptoms, many of you are like, that's anxiety, that's depression, that's trauma, that's a cold, that's the flu, that's, a heart attack. So there are all these different things that it could be. I'm not asking you all to become diagnosticians in this. I'm asking you to think about when you notice some of these things that are happening, anything on this list is not quote unquote normal. Now, some things might be more normal for you. For example, somebody that lives with ADHD might feel like they are more forgetful than somebody who's not because of the way that their brain processes and holds information. But again, just kind of paying attention to, if I'm noticing any of these things, am I talking about these things? Do I understand why I'm experiencing them? And have I just sort of conditioned myself to tolerate these things? Is that maybe a sign I need to do something different? Now, before we keep going and talk a little bit about risk factors, let's just pause in this and have you just consider some of this information. So as I went through this, I defined what burnout is, how it presents itself, some of the symptoms. I want you to consider now, what aspects of burnout or symptoms presented are you currently experiencing? Now, if you think about some of these things, now I want you to ask yourself, for how long? And go back to that question. Do I know what for, what from? Have you ever felt reprieve from them? Have you conditioned yourself to be okay with these? Do you tolerate them and then say you're fine? I also want you to think about control here. So what control do you feel you have to address or respond to some of these feelings? And this, I really want you to think about even the characteristics of burnout. If you're feeling just apathetic, overwhelmed, resentful, detached, do you have any sort of control or capacity to do much about this right now? Often burnout is associated with overperforming, giving, and functioning. So I also want you to think about what fears you would have about if you were experiencing burnout and the changes you would have to make to combat it. If you did have to give things up, if you did have to do less, what are the automatic fears, reactions, resistances that you notice? Okay, now let's take this one step further and consider risk factors that lead to burnout. Burnout requires prolonged exposure to stress that can be either through low-grade continual distress or repeated high-intensity short bursts of distress. So if we were to just do a survey right now of everything on your plate, internal, so all your thoughts, stressors, beliefs, external, your work environment, your home environment, the news, whatever state we're in when it comes to pandemic, the climate crisis, political unrest, all of these things, my guess is we could come up with a list a mile long about all the different stressors we've had on both ends of the spectrum. Now, part of the problem is we can't necessarily stop ourselves from experiencing stress. There's constantly new stressors. Part of the issue and what leads us to the risk of burnout is that we don't complete the stress cycle. For many of us, we're just in a state of input overload, always taking it on and then expecting ourselves to be fine. It's the thank you, can I have another? Instead of saying thank you, pause, I'm going to feel, process, move through, heal here, and then I'll take the next piece on. So it's the pace, it's the amount of different things that can come into play that become our biggest risk factor. And for many of us, it becomes changing the way that we exist in a world that's still primed to make us feel that pressure in order to actually stop ourselves from being on the brink of burnout for the rest of our lives. So this is really a great transition to talk a little bit about what we can do about it. Obviously, in one episode, we're not going to solve the burnout epidemic. We need to talk more specifically about just small changes, micro erosions of some of those pathways that have been less than helpful in our brain, and then start to think about how we can wire new patterns of thinking, being, showing up in the world to allow ourselves to stop being in that sort of chase for enoughness and peace. So the first thing we need to do is practice a little radical acceptance. If you haven't listened to the episode on radical acceptance yet, be sure to click the link in the show notes and spend some time there first. But for now, the overall gist of radical acceptance is to stop trying to fight what's in front of you. So again, if we think about that spectrum of stress and burnout, you're stressed, you're overwhelmed, you're not fine. In fact, say it with me. I'm not fine. And then follow it up with, and that's okay. By acknowledging where we are versus where we wish we were or feel we should be, we can actually respond to what's going on. Now, the next part is kind of a substep of the radical acceptance process. We need to let go of what isn't in our control, which unfortunately is a lot more than we wish it was. We can't control the state of the world. We can't fix everything. We can't fix other people. We can't wish away whether it's the pandemic, social unrest, changes in your corporate workplace job, what the environmental crisis looks like. We also can't control how we feel. Emotions are neurological responses. They're not chosen, they just are. So rather than trying to control them or manifest some over others, we just need to learn to feel them. So acknowledge that you have control over how you respond in the world, how you respond to what is happening, how you respond to your emotions. And we can start playing a different game where we are the drivers rather than the attempted puppeteers that are left behind. Step number 2, we need to recognize that part of the work is about not doing work. In fact, most of the recovery from burnout is about doing less rather than doing more. We need to do less covering up of our feelings, less distraction of our thoughts, less compartmentalizing of what's going on. We need to be less of a yes person. We need to focus on being rather than doing and spend less time in the past and future rather than in the now. We need to spend less time with shame in the driver's seat, constantly berating us and telling us that we're not worthy or good enough, because I promise you that's crap. You are more than fine. You are absolutely good enough. What you do, how fast you do it, how many bullet points are on your resume, how well things turn out, the number on the scale, the size pants you wear, how many reps you can do, those things don't define you. They mean nothing. I think about that even in a yoga class I had the other day where they were talking about crow pose and how awesome it was that this instructor could do crow pose. And then she said, "Do you want to know something really interesting? My life isn't better because I can do it. My life is better because I recognize that I want to set goals and work towards them If I never did crow pose again, if you never did it once in your life, you're not missing out on anything. It's the idea of creating value for yourself and working towards something that you can feel good about, not about what you actually do. And then step 3, we need to recognize the difference between a stressor and stress. Now, I started talking about this a little bit before when we were talking about risk factors, but essentially stressors are the inputs that cause you stress. They may be people, circumstances outside of you, or things internal, like a pain in your back that you keep trying to ignore, but it's getting worse, or a negative thought that you keep getting stuck in. Stressors can be sensory experiences, like a song or smell that reminds you of something, or projections or fears imagined. Ultimately, they're anything that is an input that your brain codes as a potential threat. Stress, on the other hand, is the body's response to stressors. It's the physiological and neurological cascade that occurs as a result of the stress, as a means to protect and defend against a threat. One of the things I found to be most interesting in learning about these ideas is that treating burnout is much less about the stressor and more about managing your stress. Have you ever had an experience where the stressor that had been impacting you was removed, but you still felt stressed? That's because of the embedding of that experience in our brain. We no longer require the stressor to activate the response. The brain is already activated and in turn keeps feeding back onto itself and activating itself again and again. Now, this is both a positive and negative truth about burnout. The good news is that we don't have to wait for a stressor to be gone or try to eliminate stressors in the future to recover from or treat burnout. Remember, the power we have is in how we respond to what's in front of us. So when it comes to treating burnout, the power is really in changing how we respond to any stressors rather than what we are responding to. The downside of that means that the work is on us. In some cases, it'd be nicer, right? If the stressor was just gone, we'd feel better. But that's not how it works. Now, are you ready for me to be brutally honest in that? That also means we have to stop using time as an excuse not to do what we need to do for ourselves. If you wait until there's more time to practice self-care, you're not going to do it. If you're waiting until the timing is better to leave your marriage, change jobs, ask for help, take time for yourself, it's never going to happen. Time is like gas in an enclosed container. It'll expand to whatever is on our plate. The only way to get time for something is to take it with intention and grace. So what do I mean by that? You may not be able to take it right away, with shame lurking right around the corner. Or you might take it but feel bad, so you put it back. But the truth is, you deserve to take it, and taking it is vital to the process of healing. Now, finally, step 4, give your body the tools and resources to complete the stress cycle and move forward. Treating burnout can involve a myriad of things. It might involve doing more, doing less, reflecting, processing, letting go, and so much more. When I think about any sort of response plan, I like to categorize the options into 4 main categories: how we think, how we feel, how we act, and how we connect. Because we know each of these impacts each other, and we need to address all 4 zones of functioning to move through or past a stress state. So rather than walk you through ideas for all this, I created a handout that you can download using the link in the show notes that gives you 2 to 5 tools you can use in each of those 4 pillars of self when you notice yourself getting caught in that state of stress and activation or moving further towards that burnout point. These activities are meant to be used to combat feelings of stress and burnout, as well as activities to protect against burnout. I'll also include a link to a handout I created on self-care in the show notes so that you can identify different activities that might best support you in response to burnout, but also, again, can be part of developing a daily self-care plan that buffers against that stress impact to different stressors. Now, before we wrap up this episode, I want to take a moment to remind you, incredible listeners, that healing from burnout is a journey, not a destination. It's okay to have moments of frustration or setbacks along the way. Progress is not always linear, and it's perfectly normal to experience highs and lows, dips and dives, and again, that perpetual movement up and down that spectrum. Be patient with yourself and celebrate even the smallest of victories. If you found today's episode valuable and insightful, I encourage you to leave a comment or a review. Your feedback not only fuels my passion for creating content that resonates with you, but also helps others discover these conversations about burnout and healing. Thank you for tuning in today. And remember, change takes time, but every step counts. So stay the course, stay hopeful, and stay committed to your well-being. We'll be back with more insightful discussions to support you on your journey. And until then, take care, and I'll catch you next Sunday.